The first snow of the season came early that year, the kind of snow that looks harmless in the morning and turns mean by noon, when the wind starts to slice through the pines. Grandpa Henry had lived near those woods for so long that he could read whether like other people read the news. He wasn't a trophy hunter, and he never bragged about what he did out there. For him, going into the forest was part habit, part tradition, and part responsibility. The way you check fences or stack firewood before winter truly locks the doors. That day he went out alone, moving slowly with a steady patience that only age gives you. The forest was quiet in the way it gets quiet right before trouble, as if every bird and squirrel had agreed to hold its breath. He followed a narrow trail he knew well, one that skirted old logging cuts and low ravines, and he noticed something strange, a set of small tracks weaving in circles where they shouldn't be. The prints were fresh, too fresh for comfort, and they led toward a patch of brush that looked undisturbed until you got close enough to see the ground had collapsed inward. At first he thought it was just another sinkhole, one of those hidden traps that appear when the frost loosens the soil. Then he heard it, a thin, trembling sound that didn't belong in a winter forest. It wasn't a bird, and it wasn't the wind. It was a cry, weak but stubborn, the kind of sound that says, "I'm still here," even when everything else is trying to silence you. Henry crouched and pushed aside the branches. In the dim hollow below, two bear cubs huddled together on a ledge of dirt, their fur damp with melting snow, their bodies pressed tight as if they could share one heartbeat. The pit was deeper than it looked, a steep-sided hole with slick clay walls, and there were claw marks where small paws had tried and failed to climb out. The cubs lifted their heads when they sensed him, but they didn't run. They couldn't. They were cold, exhausted, and trapped. Henry's stomach tightened. He knew what a mother bear could do if she thought her young were threatened. He also knew that cubs in a hole like that wouldn't last long once night fell and the temperature dropped again. In those woods, the rule was simple. If you are too quick, you make it worse. If you're too slow, you lose what you're trying to save. He stayed still and listened. The cubs whined, then went quiet, noses tucked under their own paws. Henry scanned the tree-line, the ridges, the thicker shadows between trunks. He looked for movement, for the heavy silence that sometimes meant a bear was watching you from 10 steps away. Nothing, only wind, and the distant crack of ice somewhere down the valley. His hands wanted to move immediately, to grab a rope, to build a ramp, to reach down and lift them out. But his brain held him back. If the mother was near, she might come charging the moment he touched them. If he startled her, she might abandon the area completely, leaving the cubs worse off than before. Henry had seen it happen with deer and even with foxes, when human scent and fear turned nature's plans inside out. So he did the hardest thing. He did nothing with his hands and everything with his heart. He backed away a few steps, kept his scent downwind as best he could, and waited. Minutes passed like hours. He watched the pit, watched the woods, watched for any sign that a mother bear had been circling the area and simply hadn't shown herself yet. The cubs cried again, louder this time, and Henry could almost feel the sound in his ribs. He whispered to himself, not words meant for them, but the kind of quiet promise you make when you're trying to stay calm. He told himself the mother would come. He told himself the smartest choice was to leave and return later, giving her time, giving nature space to correct itself. Before he went, he marked a spot in a way only he would notice, a bent branch, a small stone moved beside a stump, a scratch on bark at eye level. He took one more slow look around. Then he turned and walked away, not because he didn't care, but because he cared enough to think. All afternoon the thought followed him like a shadow. Back home, he tried to keep his hands busy, splitting kindling, checking the barn latch, setting a pot on the stove. But every time he paused, he heard that thin cry again, and he pictured two small bodies curled on cold dirt while the sky turned hard and gray. As daylight faded, the temperature fell fast. The wind picked up, and loose snow began to spin around the porch posts. Henry stood at the window, looking toward the dark line of trees, and his decision changed from careful to urgent. If the mother had not returned by now, She might be gone, injured, scared off, or worse. Night would turn that pit into a freezer, and even if the cubs survived, they could be too weak to climb out when morning came. He didn't tell anyone, not because he was hiding it, but because in his mind this was something that had to be handled quietly. He grabbed a lantern, a length of rope, an old wool blanket, and a small sack of feed. Then he stepped back into the forest, as if he were walking toward an unanswered prayer. The woods at dusk were different, full of moving shadows and unfamiliar sounds. Henry kept his pace steady, careful not to slip on the glazed patches of ice. He checked the wind often, trying to approach from an angle that wouldn't carry his scent deep into the ravine. When he reached the marker, he stopped and listened again. The pit was there, darker now, almost invisible except for the faint shine of snow on its rim. The cubs' cries were weaker, as if they had spent all their strength calling for a mother who never came. Henry's chest tightened, and the careful part of him knew that waiting any longer would be a decision too. He lowered the lantern so light spilled down into the hole. The cubs looked up, eyes reflecting like small coins, and they made a sound that was less a cry and more a plea. Henry spoke softly, low and slow, the same tone he used with frightened dogs and skittish horses. He tied one end of the rope to a sturdy tree, looped the other end around his waist for safety, and lowered himself enough to reach the ledge. The mud was slick. The cold was sharp. Every movement had to be deliberate. He managed to place the wool blanket on the ledge, not to trap them, but to give them warmth and something that smelled like human home instead of frozen earth. Then he reached for the first cub. It was lighter than he expected, and that scared him more than anything. Healthy cubs are solid with life, stubborn with energy. This one felt like a bundle of shivering bones wrapped in wet fur. It didn't fight him. It simply clung, tiny claws hooking into his jacket, as if it had decided he was the only ladder left. Henry lifted it up, guiding it into a makeshift sling he had fashioned from the blanket and rope. He pulled carefully, inch by inch, until the cub was on the ground above, where it collapsed into a trembling ball. The second cub was even weaker, and when Henry lifted it, he felt a rush of anger at the randomness of the world, the way an innocent life can be reduced to a pit and a cold night. He worked fast but gently, then sat on the snow beside them, his back against the tree, lantern light flickering. He listened again for the mother. He scanned the darkness until his eyes ached. Still nothing, only the whisper of wind and the soft, strained breathing of two small animals. That was the moment the conflict became clear, not just the danger in the forest, but the moral weight of the choice. If he left them where they were, they would likely die. If he took them home, he risked separating them from their mother, and he risked bringing a wild creature into a human space. But Henry knew one truth as clearly as he knew the path back to his house. You can't reunite a family if you let the children freeze. He bundled both cubs into the wool blanket, tied it into a careful wrap, and lifted them as one trembling load against his chest. He moved slowly at first, then steadier, keeping his steps quiet and controlled. Every so often he stopped to listen, not from fear alone, but because he still hoped the mother might appear, might follow, might reclaim her cubs right there in the snow. No mother came. The forest swallowed his lantern light behind him, and he carried the cubs all the way home. Inside, the house was warm with the smell of wood smoke and soup. Henry set the cubs near the stove, but not too close, mindful that sudden heat can shock a cold body. He rubbed their fur with a dry towel, not rough, just enough to coax circulation back into tiny limbs. He offered water first, then a little warm broth, then a small dish of softened food that a neighbor had once recommended for orphaned animals. The cubs ate like they had forgotten what eating was. Between bites they leaned into the warmth, eyelids drooping, bodies still trembling. Henry watched them with the kind of focus you usually see in new fathers, checking their breathing, noticing how one cub always pressed its head against the other, as if their bond was the only stable thing left in their world. That night Henry didn't sleep much. He kept the cubs in a corner of the kitchen with a low barrier made from old boards and a blanket. He sat in a chair with a cup of tea that went cold, listening for sounds outside, half expecting a large shape to appear at the window. He knew the mother could be anywhere, searching, circling, driven by instinct and panic. He worried that bringing the cubs inside had stolen their scent trail, that she might never find them. Morning came with pale light and a fragile calm. The cubs were alive, and their eyes looked clearer. Henry took them outside briefly to let fresh air reach them, then brought them back in. He kept his actions simple and respectful. No pet names, no playful handling, no turning the moment into a story for neighbors. He wasn't trying to tame them, and he wasn't pretending they belonged to him. He was simply keeping them alive until the forest could take them back. Over the next few days, he built a plan the way a practical man builds anything, with patience and small steps. He fed them enough to give them strength, but not so much that they grew dependent. He kept them quiet, not hidden, but calm, limiting the noise that might panic them and the scent that might spread too far. He checked the edges of his yard for tracks each morning, looking for signs of a mother bear passing through. Some nights he heard distant movement in the tree-line, branches shifting, the heavy hush of something big stepping carefully. Once he saw paw prints near the far fence, deep impressions that no cub could make. He stood still, heart thumping, and whispered into the dark that he meant no harm. Whether a bear can understand that kind of whisper, he didn't know, but he believed the forest hears intention even when words fail. Still, no mother came. The longer it took, the more Henry wrestled with doubt. What if she had been wounded? What if a trap had caught her? Or a storm had driven her away? What if she was alive, but too cautious to approach a human home? Henry felt the tension of two responsibilities pulling against each other. The responsibility to protect life in his care, and the responsibility to return it to the wild where it belongs. On the fourth day, the wind changed. The air carried a different smell, not smoke or frost, but something musky and alive. Henry noticed the cubs becoming restless, noses lifting, ears twitching toward the backyard. They paced in small circles, then pressed close to the door, making soft sounds that were not fear, but recognition. Henry's breath caught. He stepped onto the porch and scanned the yard. At first he saw nothing but snow and fence posts. Then he noticed a movement near the apple tree at the edge of the property. A large bear stood half in shadow, half in pale winter light, her body broad, her head lowered, her nose working the air like a compass. The mother had come. Henry didn't rush. He didn't shout. He didn't grab a camera or call anyone. He stood very still, hands visible, posture calm. He felt the old instinct to protect himself, because a mother bear is a storm when her cubs are involved. But he also felt something else, a quiet certainty that this moment required respect above all. He went back inside, closed the inner door behind him, and waited a few seconds to let his own heartbeat slow. The cubs were trembling with excitement now, pressing against the barrier, making small squeaks that sounded like joy trying to fit into a tiny body. Henry opened the outer door first and stepped aside. He made sure there was a clear path, no obstacles, no sudden noises. Then he lifted the barrier and let the cubs choose. They didn't hesitate. They ran, clumsy at first, then faster, paws slipping on packed snow as they raced toward the apple tree. The mother took 2 steps forward and lowered herself slightly, letting them reach her. The cubs climbed against her legs, nuzzling under her chest, making the kind of sounds that don't need translation. For a few seconds Henry held his breath, because he knew this was the dangerous part. The mother could turn and charge, driven by fear that the human had harmed them. Instead, she sniffed each cub carefully, from head to tail, as if counting bones and breaths. She looked up once, eyes dark and steady, and Henry saw not rage but caution, and something like comprehension. He didn't move. He didn't raise his hands. He simply stood there as a witness. The mother turned slowly, guiding the cubs behind her. They followed, still stumbling but stronger now, their steps more confident with her presence. They reached the fence line where the snow drifted higher, and the mother paused. She looked back over her shoulder. Henry will tell you he doesn't know what it meant, because he's the kind of man who avoids grand claims. But anyone who has spent time near wild animals knows that not every message is a myth, and not every understanding needs a human word. The mother bear held his gaze for a brief moment, then dipped her head slightly, not bow like in a storybook, but a small, clear motion like a nod. Then she turned and led her cubs into the trees, and the forest swallowed them the way it always does, quietly, completely, as if they had never been there at all. Henry stayed on the porch long after they disappeared. The yard looked ordinary again, snow, fence, apple tree, smoke rising from the chimney. But he felt changed in a way that doesn't show on the outside. He thought about the pit in the woods, about how easy it is for life to slip into trouble without warning, and about how the hardest decisions are the ones where you must act without knowing the full story. He didn't save those cubs to be praised, and he didn't do it to prove anything. He did it because mercy is not a big speech. It's a quiet action taken at the right time. He gave the mother bear a chance by stepping back at first. Then he took responsibility when the waiting turned dangerous. He helped without trying to own, and he let go without demanding a reward. Later, when someone asked him why he went back into the forest that night, he answered in the simplest way. He said he kept hearing them in his head, and he couldn't pretend he hadn't. That's the main truth of the story, the part worth carrying with you. That compassion isn't only about feeling sorry. It's about refusing to walk away when you know you can help. Somewhere out there, beyond the ridge and the ravine, 2 cubs were following their mother through winter woods, alive because one old man chose to return with a lantern and a rope. And if you ever wonder whether small choices matter, remember that a deadly pit can be the difference between silence and life, and that one careful act of responsibility can return a family to the wild where it belongs.